It's
Hello, Poultry Keepers, and welcome to another Poultry Keepers 360 Live. We are so glad you're here with us. It's fall, y'all, and that means apple pies, beautiful foliage, and that it's time to choose. So, what am I talking about, time to choose? Well, coming up, we'll explain it to you. Stay with us. All righty. I talked about it being fall, uh, all the fun things we get to do in the fall. And one of the most fun things for me to do in the fall is to pick out or select the birds that I want to keep to help move my flock forward for the next year. And I hope you'll uh, feel the same way about that. And we'll dig into that. But first, I got a couple of little housekeeping things to take care of. You can see it's just myself and Jeff Maddox and John Gunterman here with us this evening. Karen had a previous engagement, and unfortunately, Mandelyn Royal got sick at the last minute today. Uh, she needs to stop swapping those cooties around. But we will carry on and endeavor to do our very best with you tonight. Oh, Jeff, I wanted to tell you uh, a couple of shows ago, you were talking about adding copper to the waters to keep the algae and the stuff down. Got a comment on our YouTube channel from where did I put that gal's name? Simple Now that says I put copper elbows in my 5-gallon waters this summer and in the heat, and it stopped the algae growth clean.
Yep. Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, I didn't come up with it. I'm just passing along information, but yeah. I'm truly amazed at if you get the right amount of copper in there, it'll do the job.
it's amazing, it really is. I want to start our program tonight with a quote from Mandelyn Royal that I think is one of the best things that sums up selection that I have ever heard or seen anywhere. And she recently wrote an article on the American Breast Group, but it's called "Your Flock Will Become What You Select For." John, what do you think about that?
That's the ultimate goal. I'm always looking for that heterogeneity in my flock where, my birds have a certain look. I expect them to look and perform a certain way, and that form follows that function.
Now,
Well,
are you selecting within the standard though, John?
Yes.
Okay, because I know some breeders that are out doing their own thing, right?
right.
They're not worried about. They know what they want in their mind, and it has nothing to do with lining up with a standard of perfection because they're never going to show, right?
Right.
They're trying to achieve their own thing. But I just
I
wanted to
no,
clarify.
I followed that route for a little while on the
Okay.
where I was working with some really good eggers and some really good meat birds, but that they just didn't work well in between. And then I found out about this whole standard of perfection and, realized that if you bred a bird to the standard, it's going to inherently be capable of doing both if it was designed for that purpose initially.
John, let's talk for a minute, and you and y'all just jump in wherever. But what are your flock goals? I know from me, just starting over this year, so to speak, my goal for next year is I need numbers. You know,
Yes.
I've
That
got
you are exactly the same spot I am. I'm maybe 6 months ahead of you. I started January of last year with 72 eggs from my breeder and hatched them all out. And over the period of this year, selected down to the 7 birds that I thought were going to represent my line best. And now it's a matter of, taking all this development data, looking at the growth rates, looking at, the feel and the look of the birds just to get this far. And now it's counting eggs, making sure that these hens are performing, choosing my best performers. People are going to want to know, how many eggs per year did this hen lay? At least the type of person that I hope to be selling my eggs to.
Well, that's something me as a breeder wants to know too. What
Right.
was the egg production? What was the feed conversion? Those,
Absolutely. There's no slackers allowed on our farm.
and folks, I'm going to be honest with you. I wasn't always that way because I started showing when I was 19, and it was about producing the show bird. That was my main concern. Okay. But I have slowly, too slow, really, now that I think about it, I come around to seeing that there is indeed value in breeding birds that not only look good, but they grow well and they lay well, and they just really contribute to the overall success of the entire flock. And it's the entire picture. If you
And
ask,
probably the single most important thing is they breed forward true.
yeah.
Um,
John, I know that there's long-term and short-term goals. Okay. And long-term is where do I want my birds to be years from now? But do you have short-term goals that you want to accomplish in the coming year?
this year, it's all about pedigree mating and test hatching.
In
Putting this rooster with this hen, collecting those eggs and seeing what those specific chicks look like.
Yep.
And
Yep.
basically, I got to go round robin. Every rooster needs to be with every hen, and I need to hatch them all out and see what they're throwing and make sure in my head and the genetics are working the way that I think they should be, and they're producing, good offspring, and then we can start moving forward.
I can see in my birds already, and I started with eggs late in the spring this year, so I'm seriously playing catch up. But I can see little things about my birds that if I have the birds to select from, that I want to help change a little bit. Now, ultimately, my primary goal for next year is to increase the numbers. I would like to have more than 10 birds, but I can see the little things that maybe I can work on. Maybe I can't. It will just all depend on when I get down to doing all the picking and choosing and ruffling the feathers, what I've got out there.
Well, you mentioned something that does scare me right now is I've never had this few number of birds on the ground, and one good predator attack could do some real damage. So I am very specifically keeping 24 eggs just as a rolling backup. And after 2 weeks, we can eat those eggs. And I'm just always backfilling that because if I do have a disaster outside, in theory, at least I could just throw those guys in the incubator and, start over if I needed to.
And I think that's a really good practice. I have done that in the past sometimes, particularly if I had
at 2 weeks old. What's your hatch rate going to be? I mean, I hear people doing it, but everybody says 7 to 10 days. You stretch much beyond that, your hatchability starts dropping off pretty rapidly. Is that?
It does.
Okay.
I can't give you a percentage off the top of my head, but the way I always looked at it, particularly when I was thought I was done hatching, but I had a couple of 3 matings that were really, really important to me. I would save their eggs for a couple of weeks and then start over again. But it was worth it to get I would rather have had a few chicks to save my breeding efforts than I had lose the whole line. So it was a gamble that I was willing to take. And Sue Dobson says low numbers make her nervous. Sue, I agree. Low numbers make me nervous. I always have, probably always will.
It's definitely a gamble. So if you're going to keep low numbers like John's talking about, and Sue's talking about, and even Rip at 10 birds, right? You've got to step up your management skills. I mean, there is no room. There's no margin for error at all.
I've got 2 layers of electric fence. One is plugged into the house and one's on a Premier One solar charger. Everybody is collapsed back. I was in the military long enough to know how to set up a defensive perimeter.
Yep. Well, me too, but we had a lot of redundancy systems. We called it redundancy. So we had a backup to the backup
Yeah,
to the backup.
Yes,
But
yes.
so John, just have you to train your predators about every month or two, you actually want to put peanut butter on the fence,
Yes.
especially when the ground's damp, and make sure they get the full charge. So
Yes.
yeah, okay.
It's actually pretty impressive. I also will use sardines smeared on a wire.
Yeah.
S-
Peanut butter
Now,
works for most of them, but you're going to get the last few, like the possums and the skunks with the
Mhm.
sardines. But yeah,
man, I tell you what, with sardines, you probably catch me in that fence. I love those things, those and anchovies. But I digress here.
Yeah.
Let me pose this question for you, John. Going back to Mandelyn's quote, "Your flock will become what you select for." What do you think your flock needs right now? What do you see as your weak spots in your birds that you need to try to correct? In other words,
Um, right now, I've got two birds that just have this independent streak where they like going over the fence and laying their eggs somewhere out in the woods. And I don't particularly like that because I can't watch them. I can't protect them. And their eggs are useless to me if they're down in the wetland and I can't get down there and get them. So I'd really like to get rid of that behavior to some degree, but I also like the fact that they're independent and they can be out there on the other side of the wire and survive a whole lot of predator pressure.
do you think that is an indication of bird vigor when they're doing that kind of thing? Just asking out of curiosity.
I don't know what to attribute it to other than a fierce independent spirit.
I'm going with instinct and intellect. So there's something deep in that bird's brain that still exists that she needs to go find a place and hide her egg, right? Two, she's been doing it without getting caught by a predator. How many days? How often is this happening, John? So,
Yeah.
she's got an intelligence level that you're not going to get, from a hatchery bird.
Oh,
So
big
you
time.
hate to lose that. Um, but
And two
yeah,
of my
I hear
birds
you.
have gone broody now. We're October 19th. We're hitting freezing temperatures at night. And, these chanticleers, they're I think they're wired backwards. Now is when they want to raise their clutch. And in February and March, when it's -20 and deep and dark, they're pumping out the eggs.
That's interesting. I know we were talking about this before the show, and Jeff, you said you knew somebody that had a breed that was the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt Hemmer, Smoky Butte Ranch. We were talking about the Erminettes earlier, but, and he's done phenomenal things with them. But yet, as you mentioned, there's not a standard for them. So they're not, he's trying to revive the breed.
Right.
And, so he's tracking eggs from pullets and, he's only keeping pullets and hens that give, I'm going to use a number that's not 100% accurate, but like 200 eggs a year from them. So he's trying to bring that back to a standard of what the bird was designed for,
Yeah.
And get more of them out there. So that's just his project.
I remember seeing ads for Erminettes back in the 20s and 30s, if I remember correctly, in some of the old poultry magazines. And they had some stellar qualities going for them back then.
Yep,
Haynes
they sure
2
did.
Acres. Haynes 2 Acres Hobby Farm said they're working on large fowl Wyandottes in Minnesota. And I'm so glad to see somebody working on large fowl Wyandottes. And I hope they're working with colors other than white or black. There's more of those around right now than the other colors. You don't see many. I can't tell you when I've seen a good golden laced Wyandotte or a good silver pencil Wyandotte, um, they're scarce as hen's teeth to
Oh.
this day and time.
Um,
Uh,
Anna was
and I
talking about her penciled Hamburgs here.
yes. Now, interesting, penciled Hamburgs don't look anything like penciled Wyandottes. It's a whole other kind of penciling, but both of them are very beautiful patterns when you get right down to it. She's dealing with how to select eggs um, for egg production with their males, and it gets complicated. It really does. You don't have their mothers or sisters to compare to. And, the best thing I could tell you right now is just to keep really good production records going forward. Really good production records. From the time those birds had, and you want to, not only production, but growth rates and all that kind of stuff. From the time they hatch until they're a year old and even beyond. Those, may seem like a lot of work right now, but it will be your salvation down the road in years to come. So stick with it and keep those good records. You'll be glad you did.
I mean, I don't think I'm going to be ready to make my final selections till my birds have gone around the clock, so to speak, and gone through their first molt. To see, did they all molt at the same time? Did anybody start or finish early? Who got back into production? Who lollygagged around? I think that's about the time when the birds really expressed herself to me.
Yeah.
And even then, John, you want to, yes, you can make another selection at that point because you have new selection criteria. However, and just going back to Anna's comment is keeping birds for 3 and 4 and even the 5th lay cycle to track that egg production in each one of those to see who the true prolific layers are.
Yes.
So you can get really deep in this, but it sounded like she was looking for egg layers. And I'm wondering if she bought in hatching eggs or bought in chicks, what's the likelihood that she has brothers and sisters, from the same hen, who knows, right? But you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the hen carried 75 to 80% of the genetics going forward. The cockerel or the rooster doesn't have the biggest influence on the next generation. You're kind of using him because you have to. That's the only way you're going to get fertile eggs. But 2, you can make a little bit of body structure and appearance changes with the cockerel. But I don't know if you're going to get a whole lot of difference out of the egg laying capacity based on the cockerel side.
And Jeff, I'd agree with that, but don't discount the influence of a female on the appearance of your birds.
I'm not.
I'm
Yeah.
just telling the folks out there because I'll give you an example. Single comb birds. Uh, on most of them, it calls for 5 points. Some of them it calls for 6. But let's say a 5-point comb, and you've got 3 points, and you've got 6 points, and you got 7 points. They're just kind of all over the place. But you can fix that in a generation or 2 if you use a female that has a good 5-point comb. Combs to me are really one of the easiest things to fix if you use the right female.
Okay, I hadn't heard that before. For the comb, you like to use the female.
Yeah, well,
more than
I like to use a female for a lot of things, for size, for body conformation to a certain degree, obviously for egg production. Females can have at least in reds, can have a strong impact on color, both surface color and undercolor. A lot of things they play a role in, and plus eye color. You don't see many reds today with the good red eye color like we used to have. They're more yellow or bay colored, but really it should be a really truly red eye color. But kind of got off onto things here.
Yeah, it happens. It's good though. Yeah.
when you
So,
start to evaluate your birds, and John touched on this briefly, but let's talk about it again. Use your standard of perfection to guide your selection choice, but don't just use the standard. Use your hands. Okay, if you're not using your hands to evaluate your birds, you're really not evaluating your birds, because you can't tell what's underneath all those feathers just by looking at them. You got to get them in your hands. You got to feel for the fleshing. You got to feel for the body shape, because what's underneath those feathers, the body shape, can also determine how the plumage lays. It can determine the tail angle. It can determine, sometimes I think it also has an impact on the looseness or tightness of feather. But uh, don't don't go by just looking at a bird. And for heaven's sakes, don't try to evaluate a bird from a photograph, because that's even worse. I mean, that's just like uh, a moment in time, you know. And if that bird's standing all stretched out or hunched up or got one leg up off the ground, it's not going to give you a true picture of what the birds look like. It's really not. You got to get your hands on your birds. Now, if you want to know how to do that, we have a video in our Poultry Keepers 360 YouTube channel called "How Do You Evaluate a Chicken's Body When You Can't Even See It?" And in that video, I go through several tips and tricks that I use with my hands to tell me body width, body depth, uh, distance between the pelvic bones and the keel bones, the distance between the pelvic bones themselves. All of that stuff is so critical. You've got to have a good structure. You've got to have a good skeleton to have good birds. And some of you are wondering, maybe, why is that really important? Well, if you don't have good body capacity in your birds, they're just not going to produce well. They're not going to grow well, and they're not going to lay well, because they don't have the body capacity to process the food, um, and the room to produce a lot of eggs. When I'm doing an evaluation on my birds, I also like to do a feather quality check. You can look at it if you just pluck a feather out off the back and hold it up to the light. If you can see through it, it's not the best feather quality in the world. But another thing that I would do when I was judging, people didn't like to see you plucking feathers off their birds and holding them up to the light. They didn't appreciate that. But I would take the back of my hand and just rub it across the back, just from the neck to the tail, just rub it on the back. And you can actually feel good feather quality. If it feels like a smooth silk cloth, that's good feather quality. Uh, I know some judges always use the palm, but I always felt like I had a more sensitive skin on the back of my hand than I did on the palm of my hand.
I think
Now,
with access to good nutrition and good husbandry, the birds are
yeah.
going to be producing secondary metabolites,
Oh, yeah.
the beneficial oils, and they're going to be grooming and taking care of themselves. So that's going to lend itself to the smooth, silky
That,
feathers. And
it brings up another point, too, that there is both a genetic component to fleshing and to feather quality, but there's also a nutritional component. And Jeff, share with us a little bit. I I'm continually amazed, as many times as we have talked about the importance of amino acids, that it's just not clicking with some folks. But they make an incredible difference.
Okay, let's say it a different way. Let's simplify it to another level, right? So before us humans started screwing up our chickens, when they were a wild running around bird, for instance, and up where John lives, you got the ruffed grouse, or even if you look at like the pheasants running around in the Dakotas, primarily they're eating a lot of insects, small reptiles, small rodents. Yes, they're eating some seeds and some carbohydrates, but if you really looked at their diet closely, It's more proteins from a meat. Insect would be categorized as a meat protein. Um, their protein is coming from meats. Their carbohydrate or their energies are coming more from fat than they actually are from carbohydrates from grains and seeds. And we've completely, the feed industry has turned this upside down. So right now, your number one ingredient is going to be something like corn or a carbohydrate, right? Your number two is going to be a plant-based protein like soybean meal, right? And then you put some byproducts and some fillers in there. Very few feeds have a meat protein in them, if you're looking at it. Now, people, somebody asked me this the other day, well, do we really need meat protein? Can't we just add the synthetics? Sure, we can, we can add the synthetic amino acids. Is it really the same? Before the show, we were talking about laboratory meats, right? So is the, what do they even call that, John? The Impossible Burger, right?
They're beyond meat. Yeah.
Beyond, yeah. So
I have another word for it. I call it the nothing burger because
Yeah.
it does taste like nothing I'm familiar with.
all right. So nutritionally speaking, are they the same? Like if I ate some really good ground beef versus the Impossible Burger or whatever, am I getting that? Am I getting exactly the same nutrition, or am I just made to believe that they're the same? Well, look, a true meat protein, whether it's coming from insect, fish, meat and bone meal, whatever, you select it. But a meat type protein, we're never going to duplicate that with soybean meals and added amino acids. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go that far down the rabbit hole.
No,
But
I'm glad you did. Glad you did.
But here's the thing, for people that are breeding, making that selection, etc., if you don't have, there's two things you can do. You can select the birds that thrive on the feed that you're giving them, A, or B, you can give them the best feed possible, and then you'll see the true genetics come out. Because I can't tell you, since we've started doing this, Rip, how many people I've helped adjust a feed formula, and all of a sudden they're seeing new colors in what they thought was a purified line, right? New color shows up, new characteristics show up, right? Totally new body conformation. So you need to select for what you're willing to feed, or you need to be willing to feed to see what the true hidden genes are of that line. But either way, if they're your birds, you do what you got to do. But if if you're working on a line of birds, I'm just going to devil's advocate here, just going to pick on John for a minute. So let's say John was feeding Tractor Supply, layer crumbles or whatever for 10 years. He's been breeding on that with no other supplementation or whatever.
I used to.
Then all of a sudden, John gets an itch to switch over to like a premium feed. He has access to, the world's best feed. All of a sudden, his birds are not going to look like they've looked for the last 10 years. Okay. That next generation is going to look completely different. The bird's going to adapt to its environment and what we give it to eat and live. So people need to make that decision. Okay. I can't say it any clearer than that. But you can't start cheap and go good. Otherwise, you're going to have disappointment in your life. And you can't feed really expensive and really great feed now and then switch over to cheap feed later, because your flock's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
So you need to be consistent with however you're going to manage and stick to it.
Well, that brings up a concern for me. If I'm breeding my eggs, to my standard, and then I sell these eggs or chicks to somebody else who does not, feed the same feed, I'm not going to expect those chickens to grow out the same as eggs that were laid on my farm under my conditions and my feed. They're going to express phenotypically completely different based on husbandry and access to nutrition.
John, if I were you, I would actually write up some sort of a disclaimer notice saying these birds were raised under this protocol, and these are the consistent performance metrics that I see. If you choose to feed something completely different, Tractor Supply crap, that's up to you. And I'm not picking on Tractor Supply. Look, I like Tractor Supply. They're a necessary evil.
Yep.
But not really for chicken feed. But you really should have them sign that disclaimer waiver when they get eggs or chicks or whatever from you, just acknowledging that this is how you've raised them, this is what they perform on, right? They can do whatever they want. They're their birds. When the cash exchanges hands and they belong to them, they're on their own.
But it's still my birds and my reputation going out the door. I get a little possessive sometimes, I think.
I know.
Well, and there's
I'm
some
with you.
people that don't sell eggs or chick just for that reason, John. So
At least for the
lot
next
of
year or
people.
two, everything's going out saying, "Look, this is beta testing. If you're going to get chicks or eggs from me, I'm going to expect a little parlay back in the way of data, and we need to keep in contact to how everything's doing because this is all new genetics to me."
Yeah. I mean, I'd almost make them sign an agreement, but let's go back to your feather question, or your where you wanted me to fill in the gap on feathers. People need to understand this, okay? So I buy a lot of feather meal for our fertilizer side of Fertro. The reason I do that is 72% protein. Okay? Ground dried feather from, commercial chicken farms, 72% protein. It's one of the highest protein concentrations on the bird. So let's equate it a different way. If you're not feeding good quality protein, how can you expect those feathers to be everything that they need to be? And let's not feed the feathers back to the chickens, okay? So I don't want to do that.
I don't.
No, but I often wondered on processing day, all those feathers that come out the other side, it just goes out to the compost. I'm sure there's a use for that. That's better.
There is, but I'd much rather you get a pet pig or two and recycle it through the pig. And then when the pig's done with it, what you do with your pig offal, if you want to bring that back to the chickens, I'm all in. Okay. But feeding the same species to the same species, I get a little weird about that. Right.
Yeah. Kind of creeps me out a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we've all had this frustration when people ask for their chickens to be fed no meat or soy. I'm sorry, there's no such thing as a vegetarian chicken. It's not going to happen.
And I just say, I'm sorry, I can't accommodate you. You better go look somewhere else.
Well, when you see somebody feeding a 100% vegetarian diet to their chicken, chances are they're stealing feathers from their neighbor or they're finding something else in their environment to compensate. So we can live with our head in the sand and think that it's a vegetarian fed chicken, but in the real world, like you said, John, there is no vegetarian chicken.
Very true. We were talking about feathers, but Sue Dobson had asked to have a description of feather quality. Sue, I told you about the trick that I used to run my hand along the back to feel for feather quality. But you can also feel feather quality. Now, it's going to feel different in soft feathered breeds like Asiatics. It's going to have a much softer texture to it. The feather shaft will not be as stiff as compared to an Old English game or a Cornish. Those are very, very hard feathered breed. The feathers feel quite stiff. But a good feather, no matter what breed it's on, it's going to have those little barbules in there that hook onto each other to hold the feather together. If you start seeing frayed feathers, particularly around the edges on the bird's breast and some up around the back towards the base of the tail, that's where you'll start seeing that feather fraying first. And that's an indication that you really don't have good feather quality. And I will say that lavender colored birds, there's some connection, and they really haven't identified it, but there's some connection between the lavender gene and the frayed feather deal. In that lavender birds, their feathering totally breaks down across the back towards the base of the tail, and it just looks ratty. No other way to sum it up. But Sue, I told you about feeling for feather quality, but you can also look for it. Like I talked about, hold a feather up to a light. And if you can start seeing all the little veins in the feather, that's not a good sign. You want them to be well knitted together, very tightly knit together.
Rip, when you were judging or showing, did you notice a difference in feather quality throughout the year, or a difference in regional expressions within the
Well,
same breed?
I did most of my judging here in the South, so I can equate it from that standpoint. I didn't expect to see feather quality late in the year that I would see early in the year. There, you could notice a difference in seasonal variations, let's put it. Now, when I would get into other parts of the country, I didn't see that as much. So I don't know if that was climate driven or what, you know. Now, could be a difference in molting times or whatever. But I did see more of that in the Southeast than I did in the Northwest, for example, when I was judging out there. They had some amazing feather quality out there, by the way. John, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Oh, okay, go.
When you're selecting your birds, looking for those keepers, what are you looking for?
I was just going to pop up this comment, Anna, about that. I'm always looking at the pelvic width, depth, breast, just the general. I describe it as the cinder block shape. The overall structure of the body. It's not too pinched or tapered at either end. I don't like the torpedo shape of a body. To me, that just shows me that it has enough carrying capacity to hold all the reproductive organs, and the laying functions are just going to happen. The bird's not going to get prolapsed because she's too narrow, and we're not going to get into a peck out situation or something like that. A good structure is just a good, healthy bird.
When I'm evaluating chickens, I look for a bird that feels good in my hand. Okay. That they've got good fleshing on the legs, they've got good fleshing on the breast. And I don't like to feel a bird that has a V shape like that in the breast area. I want a little roundness to it. Now, I don't want a U shape, because then you're getting into the obese qualities of the broiler breeds. But you want a good fullness to the breast.
And there's some birds you just pick up the way they sit in your hand. You just it's bony. You just don't feel like a good bird. I'll set you over to this other pen.
When I'm evaluating birds or when I'm judging, I would always put the front point of the keel bone right here in my hand. And then I would run the keel bone along that middle finger so I could measure the keel bone length. And honestly, I never wanted to feel the keel bone until I was looking for it. And some birds, you picked them up, and that was the first thing you felt was a very, very prominent keel bone. And you knew right away. You didn't have to go any further. There was no fleshing on that bird.
Well, something that I look for, especially the width in the males, it didn't become a big issue for me until I did a lot of processing. When you're putting, a couple hundred birds in the freezer, having the capacity to, actually get into the body cavity and clean it out without those bones cutting your gloves or cutting your skin, it becomes a real issue.
There was and I can't remember who the heck it was, because I'd love to give him credit for this quote, but he said, the best chicken breeders eat their culls.
Mhm. But
And
when I bake a chicken, I take it apart. I study it on the plate. Now, sometimes I question my own sanity for doing that, but
well, that's a chef in
yes,
you coming out, John.
it is. I do look at the bird from the processing perspective,
Yeah, yeah.
taking it from a living, breathing animal to serving. Um, how easily is it going to work? Is it going to taste good? First off, is it going to provide people with good nutrition and good satiety and all that stuff that we associate food with?
Unfortunately, Rip, I only know a small percentage of breeders across all the breeders that I talk to and work with, even outside of this group. And
Mhm.
a very small percentage will eat their culls.
You're right.
And, and I ask them, I say, well, I use wormers and medications and all this other stuff all the time. I'm like, well, why do you do that? Right. And that's the number one reason is with all the garbage that they're putting into their bird to artificially support their health.
Yeah.
They're not willing to eat that chicken. Right. So that seems to be the fallback excuse. Now, there's a few people that because they were more like pets, they have a hard time consuming them. But more often than not, it's the people that are giving antibiotics monthly. They're giving cord monthly. They're giving this, wormers and all this other stuff. And they're not willing to eat what they're putting through their birds.
Esther Feathers want to know, is depth of keel how deep or how much flesh is over the keel bone? John, what you think?
I'm going for total length. To me, that's setting the frame and the structure that the flesh is going to build on and around.
Okay.
And then the actual fleshing would be, how much does that breast meat fill in on each side of the keel bone, front to back and left to right?
And I'm going to be 180 degrees from you, okay? I go from the depth, from the back to how low down that keel is, because the lower down that keel is, the more room you have to put muscle on it. But with that said, if you don't have a long keel, you can have the same effect too. But
Yeah, but not every breed is made to be a long keel.
No.
Right.
So, and I had suggested to some breeders to start measuring the length of their keel bone and keep track of that and make that part of, with like a flexible seamstress type, tape measure. And that needed to be part, for uniformity purposes, that needed to be part of their selection process.
Yeah.
Because I've gone in and I've seen birds with 8-inch keel bones, right? Really long football looking torpedo type birds. And they don't look right. They don't feel right. They don't fit the breed. Now, there are some breeds that's kind of what they're supposed to look like. But I think standardizing that length of your keel bone is one more, measurement.
Oh, I totally agree. I was just kind of trying to aggravate John a little bit there.
No.
No, something I've noticed that the vendors at the farmers market is the birds that are kind of in the middle that all look the same are the ones that sell. It's the ones that are on each end of the extreme. They're the last ones to sell out at the end of the day, and they're usually being discounted. And customers just like that heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Do you remember on a recent podcast we were talking about breeding extreme birds? You remember that?
Vaguely.
When you breed these extreme birds,
Yes.
the very heavy birds, the very long birds, the very tall birds, the consumer picks up on that sort of thing, and they kind of shy away from it because they've been so used to A looks like B, looks like C, looks like right on down the line like peas in a pod. They're used to that uniformity. So,
well, that's a sign of a consistent breeder too. They're going to be always putting out a consistent bird.
Oh yeah. We were talking about when I measured keel bones. I don't and I never have. Maybe I need to start following your advice, Jeff. But I never physically measured the length of the keel bone. But I would measure how far out it felt. And when I was comparing birds, okay, does this bird have a longer keel than this bird? All right, we'll put him over here. Does this bird over here have a longer keel than the one I'm getting ready to throw out? Well, if he does, well, he goes on over here with the first one. And I just did it by comparison, just sort of a general rule of thing.
Well, I think, that what you're breeding for keel is also going to change overall body conformation. And,
Mm-hmm.
where I had made that initial suggestion to measuring that keel bone was actually for some Old English game and some American game fowl breeders, where that's where you would actually want a longer keel, would be much more acceptable. But you're not going to want that on a Bress, or you're not going to want that on a Buff Orpington, or or a Black Australorp, right? That's not ideally what you're looking for. So what's the purpose of the bird, and what is the ideal look of the bird? And then, you may want a longer keel bone. So just, again, you got to fit, it's got to fit somewhat into that standard. However, I don't know that the standard really addresses keel bone length a whole lot, does it?
Not a specific length.
Yeah.
It like a lot of other things in the standard, it talks in these vague generalities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Within the breed,
Right.
it's always.
I just had a thought process that got completely away from me. Okay, sorry about that. John, has your evaluation process evolved over the years? And I think I know the answer to this based on just A, knowing you, and B, on some things we were talking about earlier. But if it has, how has it changed?
If anything, I've narrowed down my filter, so to speak. I know that everything I do is going to be reflected for the next several generations at least. And the more that I've gotten into breeding, the more that I realize, I'm standing on the work and the shoulders, so to speak, of a lot of very talented people before me. And hopefully there's going to be people after me taking this over as well. And I owe it to both sides of this continuum to do what's right for the bird and the breed.
My selection process has evolved over time. Again, like I was talking earlier, I was just solely focused on that show type. Okay, breed for show, breed for show. But since I've begun to shift my view somewhat radically to breeding for a more dual purpose bird, actually, dual purpose is not the best choice, I think. Should actually be a triple purpose, bred for eggs, meat, and show. And that's kind of the approach I'm going to be taking in the future.
That's the bird I'd like to see.
Yeah.
Somebody who works on all three qualities and can prove it with the statistics.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be around long enough to pull it off, but I'm sure going to give it a try.
You can take it the first few legs of the journey, right? And then find the right person that can carry on. So while we were talking about keel bones, Barbara had a question. Doesn't the length of the keel affect body depth measurement? I mean, the distance from the keel to the hips should be affected by keel bone length.
Barbara, when I'm measuring body depth, I measure from the back, and I put this thumb on the back, this finger on the very rear tip of the keel bone, just so I can get a consistent measurement from bird to bird to bird. But yes, to your point, it does have some influence on that. No doubt about it, in my mind.
And I've seen some keels that spread out, and I've seen other keels that kind of taper in, and that's going to affect that measurement as well. And that's also going to change the carrying capacity inside the structure. If we're looking at heart girth and width versus egg capacity, how that's angled is going to affect that.
And John, and y'all know that there's so many variables that go into selecting birds. Um, I'm not
And the perfect bird
at-
does not exist.
No, the perfect bird does not exist. And I don't feel like I'm as good at evaluation as I could be. And Lordy mercy, I've been at this 60 years roughly, because I keep learning new things. I've learned an awful lot from Jeff. I've learned, John, from you. I've learned from Mandelyn. Um, but as long as we can keep learning and absorbing information, then we can move our flock forward in the way we have to. At least that's just my 2 cents worth.
The more people I encounter, the more things I learn, and the more things I want to try and implement. And I do certain things now, and I look back and I go, why and how did I even start doing it this way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I can put it together. I learned this from this person and that from this person, and then I kind of made it my own and made it work for me.
And that's what you get. That's what everybody listening needs to do. All right. And, and each one's environment's going to be completely different. So you've got to take on management skills and techniques that work for you and your 1.5 acres, John, versus Rip, on his plot. So people, you're constantly learning, the goalpost keeps moving, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that. So
It's one thing I found about breeding birds, just about the time I think I got it all figured out, boom, the game changes. They throw you a curveball. But question for you, John, and I'm going to pick on you because Karen's not here. But when you're evaluating your birds, what kind of records do you keep? Physical note records.
It's over there. It's out of reach right now. See that chair with all my books and stuff?
I love it.
Yes, that's right next to my recliner and my lamp. And I do a lot of number crunching. Most of my production number is based on taking daily weights for the first 3 weeks and then weekly weights up until about week 20. By then, I've been able to sort my birds down to, my top 10%. And then from there, it's, figuring out what their production numbers really look like long term. Culling out the early ones is usually very easy. It's not a hard decision, and there's always ethical outlets for the culls.
I think my selection process, it's obviously changed, but if I had to summarize it, I start selecting birds from the time they come out of the egg. If there's any physical deformities, those are obviously removed. And then I will remove a bird anytime I notice a particular flaw in that bird. Okay. It may be a physical flaw. It may be a color flaw that it shouldn't have. If I see it and it's not right, I'm going to get that bird out of there, or at least move it over to the hold for the barbecue season pen.
Well, this is a good chance. I saw this question from Anna earlier. How to functionally dispose of culls for layers or bantam breeds by selling without causing a fad or accidentally promoting poor quality birds, in your area. So, what do you? It doesn't sound like Anna wants to eat her birds either. Is kind of the feeling I'm getting,
and that's fine.
Yes, around here, several people have set up kind of a quarantine area. There's a local person who comes around once a week and just takes birds, and as long as you're okay with the final end, you can drop your birds off and kiss them goodbye, and somebody will come by and pick them up. This gets turned into meat for families in need. So this is actually filling a need. There's also raptor rehabilitation centers, herpetologists. There's all sorts of outlets. A lot of people feed raw diets to dogs now. I'm going to be looking into that very soon.
I know Karen takes some of her culls. They actually have a tiger rescue center not far from her, and so she just culls a bird and takes them over there to the tiger rescue folks, and they're happy to get them.
I found a lot of these places want the animals alive if possible, and they take care of the euthanization to their standards.
Karen got lucky. They don't, as long as they're, frozen, they'll take hers frozen. They do prefer them live, but they started to bend the rules a little bit and be less fussy, for free chickens. So,
and I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but she doesn't even have to pluck them or skin them or anything.
No. Does she? I don't know. Does she eviscerate them though? Does she pull the entrails out?
I don't think so. I think she
Right.
just puts the birds down and puts them in a bag and puts them in the freezer.
Yeah.
And when she gets enough, she goes over to see the tigers.
And Anna did clarify they do eat them. That just the timing of the calls doesn't, it's just not always an option for her at the the timing wise. So.
And Anna, you may be able to find somebody who's looking for pets or layers. But like all of us experienced, the males are the hard part to get rid of. We all deal with that male cull rate.
I think this raptor thing, this raptor rehabilitation, or and actually owning raptors is becoming a really big thing. So they'll take them live for training purposes. But so Laura said that she's got a local raptor center as well. They take them gutted and frozen. So
if you check around, you'd be surprised how many raptor rehab centers there are in this country.
There's quite a few.
There's lots of them.
Yeah. And since I've started raising quail, I found an outlet with pet stores for feeders for snakes and other animals. They'll take day or two old baby quail.
If you live close to a zoo, that might be another possibility. But let me see here.
Wow. They use 1 to 2 pound chickens for whole prey for their larger African, I don't know what a serval cat is, and 2 hybrid F1 Savannah cats.
The servals are kind of a smaller Jaguarundi type thing, as best as I recall. I may be wrong there.
That's why she started with the breast for hatching year round to supplement the hatchery orders. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We're learning a lot tonight.
We are.
Oh.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just pulling that down. You're good.
Okay.
I think that's wonderful. So even the culls can serve a purpose.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There is. We just have to look for it, right?
Yeah.
And usually not too far. And once you put the name out there, people are going to find you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people are a little squeamish at first about what's going to happen to their chicken that they just raised, and I get it. But all these other animals have to eat too, right? So
one thing, and we're getting now on to our closeout time, but one thing that I want to close with, and I see this all the time, and it makes me absolutely nuts, is that folks will contact me on a regular basis. I'm going to show my bird in 2 weeks. They need to have weight. They need to have more muscle mass. They need to have better feather quality. And before I blow a gasket here, I'm going to tag Jeff in to make his 2 cents worth of comments on that. But 2 weeks, you can't do squat in.
No, they just, you can't fix, you can't fix what you screwed up for the last 20 weeks or however, 6 months in 2 weeks, right? There's very little you can do. Now, if you want to gloss up a bird You can add a bunch of cooking oil to the feed. It's going to help. That's about all you're going to do. You're not going to fix feather quality. You're not going to change body conformation, right? It's like 6 months to change body conformation and really make an effect on the feathers. You can see some feather differences in 6 weeks, but you're not going to do anything in 2 weeks.
Mm-mm.
About all you're going to do is maybe brighten up their eyes and the color of their head a little bit by doing something right, but you're not going to change. The bird is what the bird is. And, if you're going to raise birds for showing, that process starts at the hen before the chick ever got hatched.
Absolutely. Thank you
Right.
for saying that, because
Yeah.
I know they get tired of hearing it from me, so
Uh-huh.
maybe they'll listen to you if you say it. But at any rate, folks, it's time to close out. But I have enjoyed myself, and I hope you have learned a lot. Jeff and John, do either you gentlemen have anything you want to add in here before we go?
It was a great show. I
It
learned a
was.
lot. Yeah.
Learned about
Yeah.
serval cats and all these
Yeah.
kind of things.
It's always fun
Fascinating.
hanging out with you two guys.
It's always great learning experience, especially when we go off script.
Script? What script?
What script?
Well, folks,
On.
thanks for joining us. We will see you in 2 weeks. Hang in there. Keep your birds healthy. Keep your birds happy. And so long from the Sunshine State.
Bye now.